common question that folks like to posit is a historical one, and it's a hypothetical one of what would you do, or what would you have been like if you were in the situation in Nazi Germany in World War II? Particularly, to make it a bit more pointed, what would you do if you were someone who perhaps was employed as a guard for perhaps one of the concentration camps? And all of our natural instinct and reaction is to say, well, of course, we would have stood up and we would have written against the regime and the system, and we would have fought for justice based on our values from today. But unfortunately, history and even human psychology doesn't really bear that out. The overwhelming likelihood is that we are more likely to go along with the status quo, with the grain of our culture and the environment and the surroundings that we find ourselves in. And that is to say that when it comes to our values of protecting the weak and the vulnerable, and really what safeguarding is all about, we might not be as advanced at it as perhaps we think that we are. And so that is to prime us that we might have something to learn, all of us together. And I hope that we'll be able to unpack that a little bit, particularly focusing on what Aileen read for us in Psalm 82. Psalm 82 comes in, there's actually 3 books of the Psalms, and it comes in the kind of middle of the 3rd book. And all of the books in the Psalms, the kind of little collections of them, have a theme. And the theme on this one is justice and righteousness, so how justice can be served. Particularly, they're all circling around the idea of a people and a nation in national crisis. And sometimes it kind of veers into personal crisis. And what they do is what you and I often do when we're in crisis. We ask kind of, where is the goodness in this situation? Where is God in this situation? How can there possibly be a good and a just God when I am either experiencing evil or turmoil or distress, or I'm witnessing it? And in that sense, the Psalms are just such a wonderful collection of poetry, because they continue to express for us some of the deepest human longings and sentiments that are universal for all people in all times and places. And that's what the author's asking here. He's asking, where is the justice, and how does justice work, and what does God even think of justice? And this comes in the form of a very dramatic monologue, a direct reply from God. In verse 1, we read that God presides in the great assembly, and he renders judgment among the gods. And there's various theories as to who the gods might be, what their exact makeup might be in this. What we know from reading around other Psalms and reading around ideas of religion at the time is that this is supposed to be a picture of what's called the divine council. It's a really old idea in the Old Testament that God is not alone as a being with power. There are other beings, and whether that's spiritual entities, and I don't have time to go into the exact contours of that, but that's perfectly valid reading. Or sometimes gods in the Bible with a small g is anybody with power and responsibility, is humans. And if you like, and I think this is a favourable interpretation of this, God presiding in the great assembly is him rendering judgment and giving his verdict on everyone who currently has power and authority and exercises that morally. And this is a glimpse into the fact that God is above all of that. So the highest level of authority that you and I can conceive of in the world, that there is even something and someone greater that they answer to. And that's a real cornerstone of the picture that we get of the God of the Hebrew Bible, and even of the passage Aileen read for us and that Jesus gives us, that there is some sense of a final arbiter of justice that is way above all the decisions that even those powerful humans and entities and beings make in this world. And this is a picture into what that looks like, and also what the values and views of God are in terms of when it comes to justice, and particularly justice for those who are weaker and don't have much agency. So what I think we'll find in this psalm, and I was surprised as I dug into it how much it maps onto what we try and do in terms of safeguarding in the modern world, is firstly, I think it shows us that safeguarding is important because it lifts up the downtrodden. Then secondly, it's important because it demonstrates that we actually know God, the God that we profess to believe in and commune with and follow. And thirdly, if we have a good approach to safeguarding, it dispels darkness. And I think those are universal principles, but I think they're really relevant for who we are as a people and a church as well. So firstly, safeguarding, and if we approach it right and from the values that were given by God himself, then it lifts up the downtrodden. So this is God speaking to those who have authority. How long will you defend, in verse 2, the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Now the language there in the second line, show partiality to the wicked, is a kind of poetic idiom. The words behind it in Hebrew are literally, how long will you lift up the countenance or the face of the wicked? Now that sounds like a weird image to you and me, so let me explain it a little bit. In an ancient context, if you were to come to a ruler of any kind, particularly if you were coming to seek justice, your posture and your approach would be to come and have your face downcast, and then also prostrate your face and yourself before the ruler on the floor, and from that position to ask for justice. It was a position of extreme deference and humility, also acknowledging the power and the right of rule of the person beyond you. And it was also, in a sense, a kind of desperation, looking to this person for justice and hoping they will take pity on you and have mercy upon you. And what seems to be distorted in this picture, where God is, if you like, piercing through the clouds and looking on the rulers below him, it's that they're showing partiality to the wicked. What they're doing is they're lifting up the face of the wicked and the people who have no concern for justice and the people who are actually oppressing others. And they're favoring them, and what they're saying is, because what the ruler would then do was, if the person had found favor in their eyes, they would lift them up and they would say, you can look me in the face, you can be on the same level. This is my validation of you and your request. And God's looking down and seeing people are doing that to those who are the oppressors, and they're giving them favor and partiality. And you and I think, well, that's obviously a bad thing. That's terrible, and we would never do such a thing. But I wonder if there are more subtle ways that can happen. Because obviously you and I don't have any kind of a system where, even in our modern political system, you don't go with your face bowed and try to get justice that way. But you do still sometimes need to try and get justice. Good corporate example of this would be what's recently been going on, and somebody was testifying it in the select committee this week to do with the post office scandal. It was a classic case of the little people, if you like, the people who didn't have much of a voice or power, the local postmasters. Their voice was being denied, their motives were being questioned. Figuratively, their face was not being lifted up. People whose faces were being lifted up and whose voice and motives and all of that was continuing to be reinforced were those at the CEO and those at the top of the corporate structure who, through giving out bad contracts, had made other people's lives a living hell. And God looks down and sees that and says it's completely missing the mark of what leadership and what ruling is meant to be there to do. It's meant to be there so that you lift up the face of the downtrodden and the poor and those who are asking for justice. And this is important for us because I think as we think of safeguarding, there's so much in the Bible and into the New Testament, and when we look at Jesus' actions and his disposition, he's not only often found spending time with those who have not much capital or agency in that world, but he's also then validating them and giving them dignity and showing that while they may be overlooked by everyone else, they're important to God. Particularly those who are victims of the societal and the social system that they're in. And we still have people in those groups. And sometimes it's not even people in a whole class or group. Sometimes it's the people who are responding to a situation. And I think that what this impressed on me, and one way I think we could apply this, is when we do have perhaps incidents and folks come forward and say they've either been harmed or hurt, and we'll talk about this a bit later, but the churches all up and down the country are replete, unfortunately, with spiritual abuse, coercion, heavy-handed leadership, and tactics of manipulation. Do we believe these people? Do we give them a voice and agency, or do we just think that they're troublemakers and they're just trying to bring things down, or they've got a bit of an axe to grind? It's really important. Who we allow to continue to gather with us and show them favour and friendship, and who we kind of separate off a little bit, perhaps because we think they're causing some trouble. All of those things are ways that we either lift up people's face and validate their voice, or we put them away. And all of those things are ultimately important to God, because God's nature is to lift up the face of the downtrodden. And so our nature should be to lift up the downtrodden and those who feel themselves to be having made vulnerable, and to protect them and to make sure their face stays lifted up. And then, secondly, it shows that we know God if we take safeguarding and the protection of the weak and the vulnerable seriously. In verse 3, this is again God speaking to the assembled rulers and powers, if you like. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. And this verse is just loaded with so much theological significance, because the wording that the psalmist is using for defend and to uphold the cause, they're really closely related to two other words that occur all the time in the Hebrew Bible, and that's for justice and righteousness. So another way to render this would be do justice and see that righteousness is done when you're thinking of the weak and the fatherless. And the weak and the fatherless, who are they? In the text, it's kind of a shorthand for the unimportant people. People who don't really have any power, capital, or agency. The people that nobody is going to gain any status from being around them or associating with them. In fact, maybe quite the opposite. And they're being told to defend and uphold their cause, or to do justice and righteousness for them. And all through the kind of books of the law and so on, Israel is given this picture of God being one who is justice and righteousness, and who does justice and righteousness. And so he charges his people with being those who continue to extend justice and righteousness. So it's foundational to understanding the character of God himself. And justice and righteousness are, I hope, kind of fairly self-explanatory, but it's making sure that the right thing is done, and particularly making sure that the right thing is done where there is some sort of claim in the balance of those who are downtrodden and those who are weak being wronged or not. God is repeatedly saying all through the books of the Hebrew Bible to not show partiality to the rich, to the powerful, to those who have a lot of capital and agency. Why? Because that's who he is. And sometimes there can be a view that, church and spirituality and all of that, it is about our private relationship to God, and that's been very popularized in some branches of the church. It's about you and God and your prayer life and your reading of the Bible. Perhaps being kind would be then lumped in with that as well. But according to this, when God looks for a reflection of folks that know him and know his character and are actually connected to him and in relation with him, it is those who defend the weak and uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. And what's the implication of that? Not doing those things would raise a serious question mark as to whether somebody knows God. Now, that's a massive challenge, because sometimes we don't have huge opportunities to do those things, but it's about what happens when the opportunity does come along, and having our whole approach to safeguarding being shaped by that value of we're always going to try and make sure that justice and righteousness are done for those who might find themselves vulnerable. And there's lots of vulnerable categories that we have. Obviously, children's the most obvious one, but then as folks get older and have less agency and autonomy for themselves, they also become vulnerable. There are so many different entry points of which somebody with a bit more power and agency can use that over the others. And God here calls his people to be those that are vigilant and guarded and looking all the time to make sure that there are no avenues where justice and righteousness and defending those who are weak, where that could be just completely bypassed. Because the degree to which we do that and take that seriously is the degree to which we can say, we actually know our God. The goal of the Christian life is actually to become like God in Jesus. And Jesus is a walking, living embodiment of this, of defending the cause of those who are downtrodden and looking for justice for them. And indeed, speaking to and telling off the powerful and those that do have a lot of agency for their treatment of the downtrodden. A lot of Jesus's really sharp-tongued dialogue with the Pharisees is because they're those who do have quite a lot of religious capital and so political capital and power in their day. And they quite often use that to make others, the hoi polloi, feel like they're not as close to God. And indeed, they didn't help nurture and foster their connection to and relationship with God. And that outraged Jesus. And so this is consistent all the way through the Bible, that this is who God is. And so by extension, this is who we ought to be, because it will demonstrate that we have had an encounter with the living God and his concerns for justice and righteousness and defending the weak and being vigilant and looking out for the weak and making sure as far as we can that they cannot be taken advantage of. It shows that we've not only encountered God, but then we've taken God seriously and we're actually in connection and fellowship to him. And so often in Christianity, the markers of really deep spirituality are taken to be nearly anything but this. They're taken to be, people who either hide in a prayer closet for the longest, or the people who go to the most events, or the people who help and serve the most. But I think there's something really important we cannot miss here, that if we want to be people who are actually known by God, and indeed known by the wider world and our community as those who authentically and with integrity know the God of the Scriptures and who have encountered him, then we'll take justice and righteousness for the weakest amongst us really seriously, and we'll make it part of our mission as a people to continue to uphold and defend their cause wherever we find them. And it can be anywhere where there is power and there's an opportunity to use or misuse that power. And we make it our identity to always make sure that it's done with justice and righteousness. Verse 4, he asks for the weak and the needy to be delivered from the hand of the wicked. And this is almost a desperate plea to God, because it's starting to veer towards how grave it can be when that power is misused and abused. And so taking this idea of safeguarding seriously, I think it's evident that it has the benefit of protecting and lifting up and validating those who find themselves in a weak and downtrodden position. It also then evidences that we've actually experienced and encountered God, and it's had a real marked effect on our lives and how we approach life and organize ourselves. But then finally, if we do this and we do it well, it has the power and the potential to dispel darkness. And let me show you what I mean by that in verse 5. The gods, and that's in brackets in verse 5, know nothing. So those with power, agency in the world, those at the top of the three, they understand nothing. They walk about in darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. They walk about in darkness. There's so many things going on with that phrase. God always, all the way through the Old and the New Testament, I wish I had time to unpack, but I think I might bore you if I was going to go off on rabbit trails and all these things. But God consistently divulges power and authority, and then expects it to be used in a way that reflects who he is and his values. And he particularly expects people to shepherd those in their care. That's why kings are often thought of as shepherds in the ancient world and in the Hebrew Bible. And that's the kind of the image par excellence of King David. He's a shepherd king. He takes care of people. His authority and power is not just for his own advancement. Okay? And here, God is piercing through and saying, that's not the situation that I'm seeing. The gods are walking about in darkness and ignorance of their social responsibility. So those in this society are using their power in a way which is totally ignorant of the responsibility they have to the weakest and the most vulnerable in their midst. They're unconcerned about it, and they're either they don't know, which I find hard to believe, or they're willfully ignorant and they're putting it away in a cupboard in their mind, and they're thinking, or perhaps more likely, they're thinking there's no final arbitration. They're living as if, God's gone away on his holidays and he's not coming back type of thing. So they're not going to have to answer for the way that they've used their power and their authority. And this psalm was to give hope to the people of, no, God is watching and seeing, and he will call them to account. There is a kind of final reckoning. And he's saying they walk about in darkness. And the darkness is not only their own ignorance and their own willful ignorance, but it's also the environment that is engendered when the poor and the weak and the downtrodden, when their needs are not taken seriously, and when they're where there's a system where they can easily be exploited. And God calls that utter darkness. And for good reason, because there's always a contrast between light and dark in the Bible as well. And light is equated with God and with his countenance and with his commandments and with him giving us more of himself and his presence. And darkness is very much the absence of that. In the manse where I stay, there's a part of the side of the house which is just a nightmare, because every year there's all this kind of fungal and algae growth because it just gets no sun whatsoever. And I have to do various things, like a patio cleaner, whatever. But it's every single year it needs done because it's green and it's thick, and it's just stuff that you don't want. But that stuff thrives in that kind of damp, dank, moistureless, lightless, sunless environment. And for me, it's a useful picture of what we're up against in the church when we're trying to work for justice and righteousness, because where there isn't the light of God or light being shed on things, then there is more opportunity for stuff that you don't want, that really isn't good for anyone, to grow. And this is a lot to say to our church environments and cultures. We don't want to have an environment where we walk about in darkness, and certainly where those of us in leadership, which is why it's something I'm taking time to address as an important core group in the leadership of the church, we don't want to be something that fosters that walking about in darkness or ignorance in every way. We want the light of God and his truth and his goodness and his justice to pierce through, shed light on everything that we can, because we actually believe that protects everybody. And that I take that really seriously as someone who's charged with helping to lead the church. Because I've read all the same news stories as you. Church of England did a massive report earlier this year on huge safeguarding failures. And I'm not singling out or picking on the Church of England. I'm just taking ones that might be fresh in your memory. And now you might think, well, that was clearly, that was a few bad apples in terms of the leadership, and a few maybe, narcissists who were priests and abusing people, and that is the kind of thinking I'm trying to move us away from, because it's the initial reaction to think, oh, it's not that bad, and it's not everywhere, and it's obviously just a few individual people, because it's not. Because any of you who have been on the safeguarding elder training will have been told with good reason that this is everybody's responsibility. I alone cannot shed enough of the light and the truth and the goodness of God in a whole church in order to make it the safest environment possible. I can do my bit. And every individual trustee and every elder and every person who helps to lead a core group, all of us can just do a bit of it. But if enough of us are committed to having an open and transparent and light-filled culture, then that should be enough to bring enough light all around so that people are protected. And let me give you another couple of examples to really draw out this difference between light and darkness and who is able to make a difference with it. Well, some of the worst kind of instances where you might have heard of names like Jonathan Fletcher and Mike Pivolacci, really, really powerful movers and shakers in the Church of England system. Mike Pivolacci led Soul Survivor, which was a massive Christian festival and gathering that young people went to. They would go and they would be converted and saved in their droves, and it was seen as just a brilliant ministry. But it came out that Mike and other people around him had enabled a system where there was really, really deep harm and abuse. And I don't really want to go into the details. You can look it all up. But particularly abuse of certain young people. But there's a good documentary about it on YouTube, and some of the people in that say that it was their experience that it was impossible to get anyone to listen to them if they were a victim of any of the abuse. Why? Well, because not only was Mike such a great, charismatic and important figure, but also the work that he was doing was seen to be so brilliant and so in keeping with advancing Christianity, particularly where Christianity and churches are struggling. So nobody wanted to be the person who was, doing in the church. But I would like to say this morning that I would rather, if there is a church culture or system where there's the opportunity for anyone to be abused, that the whole thing gets shaken and brought down in the pursuit of truth and justice for those people. Because I think the thrust of this passage is those people are actually too important for anyone to be worried about the fallout or the implications of the church, or whether it'll put more people off the church, or whether the church will be in the papers. All of that is too important to overlook justice and righteousness for someone who's found themselves in a weak position and someone over them is using their power over them. Should be the last thing we think about, if it's something we think about at all. But some of those situations could have been avoided and prevented if more people around had said, that doesn't look right. That is not right. I have worries and suspicions about that. I'm maybe not going to be the person that blows the whistle, brings the whole thing down, but I'm going to go and speak to people about that. And so many of the folks who've done the worst damage in those situations got a pass because they were either really gifted or in a really important position or whatever it is. But it shows that the responsibility for that had to be absolutely everybody's. Because all it takes for evil or darkness to thrive is enough people to put the blinkers on, or to turn away, or even to have, and this happens a lot, the cognitive dissonance to go, I think there might be something, probably, but I don't really want that to be true. Don't really want to believe that either they could, or and I've seen this, I've encountered this when I've had to be involved in safeguarding things, is sometimes you're still dealing with folks who go, oh, I don't really think people are like that, are that bad. The world has a lot of very, very malicious, evil, predatory people. And the Bible gives you plenty of resources for showing how depraved and dark the human condition is. So that should not be a barrier for any of us to go, actually, I want to maybe raise the alarm. Calls us to wake up and not be asleep and not be walking in darkness and not give the darkness an inch collectively, because who amongst us wouldn't want to, and rather to live in a culture and in an environment and in a church of light, where the light and the truth of God, where the justice and the goodness and the righteousness of God are our values and what we celebrate and what we champion and what we actively try and protect and pursue at every opportunity. And the darkness, where there can be an undergrowth and where things can germinate that are abusive and harmful, and people can use their power in an unholy way or another, is something that we just won't put up with, and we just won't even allow to begin to form. So I hope you can show that safeguarding gets a bad rap, and sometimes it's not helped by some of the bureaucracy around it, okay? But it's important and necessary, because if we take it seriously, it has the ability to lift up and value some of the weakest people amongst us, which is a core Christian value. It also has the ability to show that we really know and take God seriously and demonstrate our faith in the world that we're in. And lastly, it absolutely has the power to completely dispel darkness and to bring in more of the light of God to our experience. May God bless his word to us. Amen.